Most people don't ignore shady spaces in their garden because they want to. They ignore them because they've been told over and over again that fruit trees simply won't grow there. 6 to 8 hours of full sun, that's the rule, right? And anything less than that feels like wasted space. But here's where things get a little more interesting. That advice isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. Because not all fruiting plants were designed for open fields and full sun. Some of them actually come from the opposite environment. They evolved slowly under the shade of taller trees, in forest where light is filtered, soft, and constantly shifting. And once you understand how those plants really work, you start to see your garden a little differently. That quiet corner, that shaded patio, that spot you almost gave up on, it might not be a limitation at all. In this video, we're going to walk through a group of fruiting plants that can handle shade surprisingly well. But more importantly, we'll talk about what shade actually means, what these plants truly need, and where most people go wrong when they try to grow them. Because growing in shade isn't about shortcuts. It's about understanding the conditions and working with them. One of the biggest misunderstandings in gardening is the word shade. Because shade doesn't mean no light. It almost never does. In most home gardens, shade still includes a surprising amount of indirect light, reflected light, and short windows of gentle sun during the day. And those small differences matter more than people realize. There's a big difference between partial shade, where a plant might get a few hours of soft morning sun, and deep shade, where light is filtered through multiple layers of trees and barely reaches the ground. Most fruiting plants can tolerate some shade, but very few can handle deep, dense shade all day long. That's where expectations start to break down, because when people hear shade tolerant, they often assume it means the plant will grow and produce well anywhere. But in reality, it usually means something much more specific. It means the plant can survive and sometimes even grow comfortably with less direct sunlight than most others. But fruit production, that's a different story. Less light usually means slower growth, fewer flowers, and lighter harvests. And that's not a failure, that's just the trade-off. So before choosing any plant for a shaded space, it helps to ask a simple question. Not, can this grow in shade, but what kind of shade do I actually have? So, if some fruiting plants can live in shade, the real question becomes, how? Because they're not just tolerating low light. Many of them were shaped by it over thousands of years. They come from forest environments where sunlight is filtered, scattered, and constantly changing. And in those conditions, plants adapt differently. Instead of growing fast and tall to compete for full sun, they slow down. They focus on efficiency, capturing whatever light is available and using it carefully. You'll often notice their leaves are larger, thinner, sometimes darker in color. That's not random. It's their way of increasing surface area so they can absorb more of that limited light. Their roots behave differently too. In many cases, they prefer consistent moisture, cooler soil, and a more stable environment overall, which is exactly what shaded areas tend to provide. But there's a trade-off here, because while these plants are well adapted to survive in shade, they're not designed for speed. They grow slower, they take longer to mature, and fruit production tends to be more gradual. From my experience, this is where a lot of frustration comes in. People expect these plants to behave like full-sun fruit trees, just placed in a darker spot. But that's not how they work. Once you shift your expectations and start working with their natural rhythm, they can actually become some of the most rewarding plants to grow. One of the most common mistakes people make with shade fruit plants isn't about the plant itself. It's about the expectation they bring into it. Because it's very easy to hear shade tolerant and quietly translate that into, this should work just as well. But in most cases, it won't. A plant growing in shade is playing a completely different game than one growing in full sun. It has less energy to work with, less light to convert, and that changes everything. Growth slows down, flowering becomes less consistent, and fruiting becomes more selective. Not impossible, but less predictable. And here's where frustration usually begins. You water correctly, you use good soil, you follow all the right steps, and still, the plant just sits there. Maybe it grows, but slowly. Maybe it flowers, but doesn't hold fruit, and it feels like something is wrong. From my experience, this is where many gardeners give up too early. Not because the plant failed, but because the expectation didn't match the environment. Shade growing asks for a different mindset. It's not about maximizing speed or pushing for the biggest harvest possible. It's about working within limits and appreciating what the plant can realistically give you. Because when those expectations line up, what once felt like a problem starts to feel like a very usable, very quiet advantage. Growing fruit trees in containers can feel like a perfect solution for shaded spaces. You can move the plant, adjust the position, control the soil. It sounds flexible, and in many ways, it is. But containers don't just give you control. They also introduce a new set of limits. In the ground, roots can spread out, search for moisture, find nutrients over time. In a pot, everything is confined. The soil dries faster. Nutrients get used up more quickly. Temperature changes happen more suddenly. And in shaded conditions, those small limitations can become more noticeable. Because the plant is already working with less light, so any added stress has a bigger impact. From my experience, this is where things either work beautifully or start to struggle quietly. A well-managed container with consistent moisture, stable soil, and the right size can support healthy growth even in partial shade. But a small pot or inconsistent watering can slow things down even further, especially with fruiting plants where energy demands are already higher. So container growing isn't a shortcut, it's a trade. You gain flexibility, but you take on more responsibility. And once you understand that balance, it becomes much easier to make it work. Let's start with one of the most unusual plants on this list, miracle fruit. It's often introduced as something almost magical, a plant that can turn sour flavors sweet for a short period of time. And in many ways, that's true. But growing it is a very different experience from hearing about it. In its natural environment, miracle fruit grows under dense tropical canopy, where light is soft, humidity is high, and conditions stay fairly stable throughout the year. And that tells you something important right away. This is not a plant that simply handles shade. It depends on a very specific kind of shade. Bright, indirect light, warm temperatures, consistent moisture, and most importantly, acidic soil. From my experience, this is where many growers run into trouble, because the plant may look fine at first, but over time, leaves start to lose color, growth slows down, and fruiting becomes inconsistent. Not because the plant is difficult by nature, but because its conditions are easy to get slightly wrong. Even small changes in soil pH or inconsistent humidity can quietly affect how well it performs. So while miracle fruit is absolutely possible to grow in a container, it tends to reward attention and consistency more than almost any other plant on this list. If you enjoy that level of care, it can be a fascinating addition to your garden. But if you're looking for something more forgiving, there are easier places to start. Compared to miracle fruit, Suriname cherry feels a little more forgiving. It's one of those plants that adapts more easily to different environments, including partial shade. In its natural habitat, it often grows along forest edges, not in deep shade, but not in full sun all day either. And that balance is important. Because while Suriname cherry can grow in lower light, the quality of its fruit can change quite a bit depending on how much light it receives. In brighter conditions, the fruit tends to develop more sweetness and a fuller flavor. In heavier shade, it can become more tart, sometimes even slightly resinous. The plant itself may still look healthy. Leaves can stay glossy, growth can remain steady, but the eating experience shifts. From my experience, this is where expectations need a small adjustment again. Because the goal isn't just to grow the plant, it's to enjoy what it produces. In partial shade, Suriname cherry can still be a very reliable container plant. It responds well to pruning, stays relatively compact, and can fruit more than once a year in the right conditions. But if flavor is your priority, it often helps to give it just a bit more light whenever that's possible. Even a few hours of gentle sun can make a noticeable difference. Feijoa is one of those plants that starts to change how you think about shade. Because in some cases, shade isn't just something it tolerates, it can actually help. In hotter climates, full sun can sometimes be a little too much, especially during long afternoons when heat builds up and moisture is lost more quickly. And that's where partial shade becomes useful, not as a limitation, but as a form of protection. Feijoa naturally grows in regions where conditions aren't extreme. Cooler air, occasional cloud cover, and a mix of sun and shade throughout the day. So when you place it in a space with some afternoon shade, you're actually getting closer to that balance. From what I've seen, this often leads to more stable growth, less stress during hot periods, and in some cases, better fruit quality. The fruit itself develops more slowly, but with better moisture retention, the texture and flavor can improve, especially if you're growing in containers where soil can heat up faster than in the ground. A bit of shade helps moderate that. So this is one of those rare situations where adding shade doesn't reduce your results, it can actually support them. Jaboticaba is one of those plants that completely resets your sense of time in the garden because nothing about it feels fast. It grows slowly, sometimes just a little each year, and in a container, that pace becomes even more noticeable. But that slowness is not a weakness. In many ways, it's exactly what makes this plant so well suited for shaded container growing. It doesn't rush. It doesn't demand constant adjustment. It settles in and builds gradually. In its natural environment, jaboticaba grows beneath a canopy of dense forests where light is limited and conditions stay relatively stable. So instead of stretching aggressively towards sunlight, it adapts to consistency. From my experience, this is where container growing actually works in its favor, because a stable pot with consistent moisture and protected light can closely match what it prefers. The trade-off, again, is time. Jaboticaba doesn't rush to fruit. It develops slowly and rewards patience rather than effort alone. But when it does fruit, it does something very few plants can. The fruit forms directly on the trunk, clustered along the bark, in a way that almost doesn't look real. And that moment, after years of slow, steady growth, tends to feel very different from anything fast-growing ever could. Up to this point, most of the plants we've talked about can handle shade, but they still benefit from some light. Lingonberry is a little different, because it doesn't just tolerate shade, it actually comes from environments where shade is the norm. In the wild, it grows across northern forests, under conifer trees, where sunlight is limited for most of the day. And yet, it continues to grow and produce year after year. This is what true shade adaptation looks like. Not fast growth, not large harvests all at once, but steady, reliable production over time. The plant itself stays low and compact, rarely growing tall, which makes it especially well suited for containers. And because it's evergreen, it keeps its structure and color even outside the growing season. From my experience, this kind of plant works best when you stop expecting dramatic change. It doesn't suddenly take off. It doesn't demand attention. It just continues quietly. The fruit is smaller, more tart, but very consistent once established. And in cooler climates, it can even produce more than once a year. So if your space is closer to deep shade and you're looking for something dependable, this is one of the few plants that truly fits that role. Serviceberry sits somewhere in the middle of everything we've talked about so far. It's not a deep shade plant, but it's also not dependent on full sun all day. In nature, it often grows along forest edges, where it receives a mix of light and shade throughout the day. And that balance is exactly what it responds to best. With enough light, it can grow steadily, flower reliably in early spring, and produce a consistent crop of fruit. But as light decreases, you may start to notice small changes. Flowering becomes lighter, fruiting becomes less abundant, and growth slows slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to shift the overall result. From my experience, this plant works best when you aim for balance rather than pushing it toward either extreme. Too much shade and production drops. Too much intense sun, especially in hotter areas, can create stress of a different kind. In partial shade, especially with some morning sun, serviceberry tends to settle into a very stable rhythm. It may not be the fastest or the most productive, but it's one of the more consistent when the conditions are right. When it comes to colder climates, the conversation around shade changes a little. Because in many regions, light isn't always the main limitation. Temperature is. And that's where haskap begins to stand out. This is a plant that was developed and selected in some of the coldest growing environments on Earth. It can handle freezing temperatures, late frosts, and short growing seasons in a way that most fruiting plants simply can't. And because of that, It doesn't rely on intense sunlight to perform well. In fact, in many cases, partial shade can actually help maintain more stable conditions. Cooler soil, less heat stress, and a more even pace of growth. From my experience, this becomes especially useful in containers because pots tend to heat up faster and cool down faster, which can create stress in full sun. In partial shade, those swings are reduced, and the plant can focus more on steady development rather than constant adjustment. One important detail, though, haskap usually performs best with more than one plant. It relies on cross-pollination to produce consistent fruit. So while it's quite forgiving in terms of light, it still benefits from thoughtful setup. In the right conditions, it becomes one of the earliest fruiting plants in the season, often producing before many others have even started.
Cornelian cherry is not a fast plant, and it doesn't try to be. This is one of those trees that follows a very different timeline, one that stretches across seasons and even years. But along that timeline, it offers something few others do. Very early in the year, often before most plants even wake up, it begins to flower. Small, yellow blooms, appearing while the rest of the garden is still quiet. And that early start is part of what makes it so interesting, because it spreads its energy out over time rather than concentrating everything into a short burst. After flowering, fruit development takes patience. It doesn't rush. It doesn't push for quick results. It builds slowly, through spring, into summer, until the fruit finally ripens later in the season. From my experience, this is where many people lose interest, not because the plant isn't working, but because it asks for time without immediate feedback. In partial shade, this slow rhythm still holds, sometimes even more gently. Growth remains steady, but never hurried. And in containers, that pace can actually be an advantage. Less aggressive growth means easier size control and a more manageable plant over the long term. The fruit itself isn't about sweetness alone. It's more complex, slightly tart, and often improves as it fully ripens. So this is not a plant for quick results. But for those who are willing to wait, it becomes something far more consistent and quietly dependable over time. Pawpaw is probably the most misunderstood plant on this list. Not because it's difficult, but because it changes over time. In its early years, pawpaw behaves very much like a true shade plant. It prefers protection, soft, filtered light, and struggles if exposed to too much sun too soon. This is where many growers get confused. They hear that pawpaw can handle more light and move it into full sun too early. And the result is often stress, slower growth, or even leaf damage. But as the plant matures, something starts to shift. It becomes more tolerant, more resilient, and gradually capable of handling brighter conditions. Not extreme heat, not harsh all-day exposure, but more light than it needed at the beginning. From my experience, this transition is one of the most important things to understand, because pawpaw isn't just a shade plant. It's a plant that moves through stages. In containers, this becomes even more relevant. You have the ability to adjust its position over time, starting in deeper shade, then slowly introducing more light as it grows. And when that balance is right, pawpaw can produce something truly unusual, a fruit that feels almost tropical in a temperate garden setting. So it's not about finding the perfect spot, but about understanding the timing and adjusting as the plant develops. So when you look at all of these plants together, It's easy to feel like you've discovered a hidden shortcut, a way to grow fruit in places that once felt unusable. But the real value here isn't the list itself. It's the way you think about your space. Because every shaded area is different. Some get a few hours of soft morning light. Others stay cool and dim most of the day. And each plant responds to those conditions in its own way. So instead of asking which plant is best, it often helps to ask, what kind of shade do I actually have? And just as importantly, what kind of result am I expecting? Do you want steady, reliable growth? A small but consistent harvest? Or are you hoping for something more productive with a bit more light? Because once those expectations are clear, choosing the right plant becomes much simpler and much more realistic. Some plants will reward patience. Others will reward careful placement. And a few will simply work quietly in the background without asking for much at all. From my experience, the most satisfying gardens aren't built on perfect conditions. They're built on understanding and small adjustments over time. So take a moment, look at your space again, that shaded corner, that patio, that spot you once ignored, and see it a little differently now. Not as a limitation, but as something you can work with. And if you enjoy this kind of slower, more practical way of gardening, you're always welcome to subscribe. We take our time here and explore what actually works over the long term. Until then, just start with one plant and let it teach you the space.